It has been 25 years since the GeForce 256 launch, an Nvidia GPU, the first of its kind, and today on Digital Foundry, I have a special direct panel kind of here for the day where we're going to talk with people who worked on the original GeForce 256 project to ask them how it was, what its effect was on the industry, and just what it was like back then.
Digital Foundry is proudly sponsored by MSI's range of next-generation QD-OLED monitors, available in 32 and 27-inch 16:9 configurations, along with ultra-wide 32:9 49-inch and 21:9 34-inch models. These are some of the best monitors we've ever tested, with incredible motion clarity, HDR True Black 400 support, OLED burn-in protection, AI features, and genuinely game-changing performance. Check the video description to learn more, and for UK viewers, a chance to win an MSI 27QRX QD-OLED, a Metaphor ReFantazio PC and Xbox game code, and exclusive tote bag.
Everyone, if you could please introduce yourselves and what your current position is, and maybe what you did back then.
I guess I'm in the upper corner, so maybe I'll start. I'm Nick Stam. I've been at Nvidia since early 2005, right before the 7800 GTX launched. I run a technical marketing team that provides tech support to North American and APAC product reviewers directly, and also analysts across most of our product lines. Now, we work closely with engineering, product management, marketing, and PR. We're kind of like a tech PR in some respects. We also work closely with Adam Fotes, EMEA tech marketing team, who you guys work with, I'm sure, and are also our Latin America team. My team creates the main GPU reviewer guides and also the big GPU white papers that all of you love to read, bedtime reading, great stuff. Anyway, we also test our own products internally before launch, which better prepares us for review support and also helps with product readiness. My team's under John Spitzer's org. And before NVIDIA, I was lab director and technical director of PC Magazine US for about 13 years. I also co-founded the Extreme Tech website. I know it's a little long here, but when at PC Magazine, we started Extreme Tech, and it was, trying to compete with Anand, and Anand's gone now. That's just too bad. And Tom's Hardware and Sharky and Hard OCP, etc. So regarding GeForce 256, my involvement, I was actually at NVIDIA's GeForce 256 initial announcement delivered at the Intel Developer Forum in August 99 as a press person. So I attended Jensen's exciting press Q&A session. It was really awesome. Anyway, that's me. Kind of long-winded, but that's me.
So I'm John Montrym, Chief Architect at NVIDIA. I joined the company in 1997 and was lead architect on what we called NV10 in those days, what became GeForce 256. I've retained the title over the years, worked on many GPUs since then, transitioned to various other responsibilities more recently. And before NVIDIA, I was 10 years at Silicon Graphics, building very large graphics systems.
Yeah, my name is John Spitzer. I'm the VP of Developer and Performance Technology. That consists of 6 engineering and art teams that makes up about 650 people. So we span the gamut between gaming developer technology, what we call DevTech. We are the technical arm of developer relations. We teach developers how to make the most out of our chips and our technology, whether it be AI or graphics. We also have the tech marketing team under Nick Stam. We have the Lightspeed Studios team, which is consisting of the RTX Remix platform you're probably familiar with. We did Portal with RTX. We also work on demos for things like keynotes. So all of those assets, cool stuff that you may see in factories or in warehouses. We have people who are modeling those so that they can be used in digital twins and such. We also have the Performance Lab and automation platform, which spans the full gamut of all of our platforms, from the smallest embedded device to clusters of thousands of GPUs that are doing training. And then we have a team that is focused on digital human technology as well as ray tracing. So it's Kind of, yeah. So my exactly kind of grown. People are like, why would you put all of that in one team? It's sort of grown organically over time, but it's a great team, and I love working here. So I joined Nvidia actually in October of 1999, which is the time span that we're talking about. And but slightly after the launch of GeForce 256, I actually started on the 28th of October in 1999. I was there because I had been working at a startup at the time. Before that, like John, I had been at Silicon Graphics, and prior to that, I had been at IBM, where I was the architectural review board member of the OpenGL committee for OS2. So if you remember OS2 Warp. So I was sort of like trying to figure out how to add 3D to OS2 Warp back in those days. And I also participated on some benchmarking committees and co-wrote a benchmark called ViewPerf, which I don't know what generation of it is in production today, but that was like over 25 years ago. So I've had a long storied career in 3D graphics, and now with AI, it's become more interesting than ever.
Yep. So I'm Jacob Freeman. I've been at Nvidia only 2 years, but I'm definitely no stranger to the industry. I've been in this industry for about 20 years now. Prior to Nvidia, I was at EVGA for a really, really long time as a product director. And prior to EVGA, I was at it was a retail chain of stores called PC Club. I worked on the product team, so I tested a lot of the products that went into the stores. That was like in the GeForce 4 era. So in 1999, I was actually not technically in the industry, although, I was a huge fan of graphics tech at that time and hardware. I spent a lot of time playing Quake 3 Arena, which was like my favorite game at the time. I thought I was really good at the game, but probably not as good as I thought I was. So yeah, this is pretty exciting, and celebrating the anniversary of GeForce 256, I think is amazing.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, like Jacob, I was not in the industry back then. I was 9 years old in 1999, but I still played with GeForce Tech back then, and of course loved my hardware TNL. Okay, so the first question I'd like to go around and pose to everyone is, what does GeForce 256 mean to you in just one sentence?
Okay, I guess I'll go first again. So speaking as a press person at the time, that's the way I've got to think about this. GeForce 256 really showed me that NVIDIA had established itself as a technology leader. Really, it was setting itself apart from the competition in terms of speed of innovation. Every 6 months, new GPU, crazy. And really driving the industry forward, bringing advanced graphics tech to the mainstream gaming PC and to gamers. It's a long sentence, but that was one sentence.
With semicolon. Yeah. I know. I'm going to do the same. Don't worry. John, if you would.
I look on that time developing GeForce 256 as, I guess, a highlight of my career, but also a highlight for the industry. It was visceral how impressive it felt to be bringing what had been very big, expensive graphics iron to the tune of $60,000 and $100,000 systems, to be bringing that level of performance into consumer price points and bringing 3D to the masses.
Yeah, I totally agree with John here, is that it really painted a view for the future of gaming, in that it was able to bring all of the technology, which usually was made of, a dozen or more chips, into a single chip. And then the future was clear at that point, is that was going to become more and more capable. Especially, it was sort of forecasting a view or a future for pixel shading with the .3 capabilities that it had, as well as the cube mapping, which when I was first introduced to cube mapping, it was just on the Reality Engine, $100,000 hardware. And so that the fact that you would be able to have this on a consumer level GPU was just amazing.
Yep, and again in 1999, I was just a hardware enthusiast fan, but even at the time, GeForce 256 was pretty revolutionary in its design and bringing the transformer lighting engine to the GPU from the CPU. At the time was pretty revolutionary and kind of paved the way for the future of the GPU.
Okay, so what would you all say, and anyone can really respond to this, as like what the lasting impact of the GPU was, and what was the era before the GeForce 256 actually like, the entire industry? Because you guys just described one coming from SGI, describing this era in which the functions that hardware TNL and other aspects of the GPU, those are specialized chips and very expensive. What was this era actually like, and what was the impact of GeForce 256?
The GPU really became a first-class citizen in PC architecture, of course. Very important to have a powerful GPU for many types of things, not just gaming. Creative uses, engineering, 3D modeling, all those things. So it really established, I think, the category and solidified, GPU just as important as CPU, sometimes more important than CPU, oftentimes today more important than CPU. But yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, I think it really ushered in an age of a unprecedented level of geometric complexity in gaming. Prior to that, we were looking at just heavily textured, but largely very low tessellation sort of geometry that lacked realism. You would always see a silhouette. Even if the interior was heavily textured, the silhouette was always very coarse and janky looking. So, this was just the first step in being able to bring really sort of immersive images into a game.
I think of it as, again, I use the word milestone repeatedly. In this case, what I'm thinking about is it was the first step where NVIDIA began to have to pay attention to how to help developers along to get the most out of the technology and the capabilities. When we were architecting NV10, GeForce 256 with TNL, we weren't at all sure that it was going to have uptake. And so we were extremely careful as we architected it to keep it compact and efficient on the premise that maybe it would be wasted hardware. Early on, we weren't sure that it would be taken on. And we were in a competitive business where you couldn't just put down gratuitous silicon because it was going to deny you horsepower that you might need to compete with your fellow 40 other graphics companies at the time. So we were careful about how much we spent on it. Once capability was there, we said, now we need to educate the world to how to use it and educate them as rapidly as possible so that they started getting value out of that hardware that we had put in. And that's something that we've been doing ever since. You think of all the architectures that came afterwards, we had an education problem to solve, and NVIDIA's built a tremendous organization capable of doing that. But that was the first. That's where we had to get that going.
Yeah, if you think about it, it comes with the advent of DirectX 7, vertex buffers, and a whole lot of problems that developers themselves didn't necessarily have to solve through the API in that way before. Can you actually talk a bit about that education process back then and what you saw the uptake was, both immediately after launch and in the year following?
Well, I really throw that question to John Spitzer because that's fundamentally his area of responsibility and ownership. And that wasn't something that was directly my responsibility. I sort of handed it off and said, okay, now go ship millions of these things. And we were certainly engineering and architecture would support this external education effort, but it became a massive capability of the company all on its own. And John represents that on among the folks on this call.
Yeah, so if we rewind to 1999, when I joined, this is again immediately after we launched GeForce 256, the developer technology team back then, and there was only one because all we did was gaming back then. So, now we have dev tech teams that are covering everything from biology to chemistry to oil and gas exploration, obviously video processing, codecs, there's like every span of every vertical market. We have developer technology engineers that are focusing educating developers on how to make the most out of our hardware and software platforms. But back then, we were 4 engineers, and that was it. And it was sort of a ragtag, thinly stretched team where we would go to developer conferences and sort of like devise techniques and hope that somebody would pay attention to us. I mean, because we were one of many players back then. I mean, people think Nvidia now, one of the richest companies and one of the most valuable companies in the world. We're the 500-pound gorilla. But I mean, back then, we were 300 people. I mean, and you would be surprised if you were going through the airport and you had an Nvidia piece of paraphernalia that anybody would even know who you were. So, I mean, it was really, we were pushing the rope a lot is what we say. We were taking the technology and we were trying to entice developers into using it. And it was usually startups and small developers that were taking the technology and exploring with it. And those were the guys that were the hungriest and the most willing to take risks. But I still have personal relationships with some of those guys after 25 years, forged out of those early days.
If you were to just describe it simply for the audience who maybe doesn't know, what is actually the importance of having hardware transform and lighting on a GPU? What made it so different than what it was before in the consumer graphics space?
I can take that. I mean, functionally, it was identical, right? I mean, there's no difference between having the CPU do the TNL or having the GPU do the TNL. It's all a matter of performance. I mean, if you were going to look at transformative sort of things that came about through GeForce 256, I would lean on the cube mapping and on the .3 capabilities in the pixel shader. This is the capability of, actually applying per pixel bump mapping to a polygon. And that wasn't really something that we could do before. TNL was just that we could throw more complex geometry at it, but, that's a chicken and egg problem. Until you have a sizable enough install base, developers aren't going to move. So, and you could say the same thing about .3, but that was very interesting to developers because they had never had that capability in the past.
The description of it, though, about what it does in software, but what did it actually mean from the hardware perspective, adding in new specialized units to the GPU to make the GPU in the first place? What were the risks?
The amount of floating point horsepower that you needed to deliver these numbers, we were talking about 10 to 15 million vertices per second of transform hardware. These were enormous numbers back in the days when graphics chips really had almost no floating point on them at all. It was a whole bunch of fixed point because the transistor budgets were just extremely limited. And so it was like looking at a big wall to decide that we were going to go do this. And then think about exactly what does that mean in terms of the silicon area you potentially have to spend. I recall at the time, as we worked very hard to make things compact, makes things efficient, looking back on it shortly after we'd done it, I realized that we had spent what amounted to maybe $2 worth of silicon area incrementally on something that my previous project at Silicon Graphics had cost $2,000 in bill of materials. There was this one-off cliff, and it didn't repeat itself over time, but at that one time, because of a number of factors, including volume and other efficiencies that NVIDIA had, so many things put together, you had 1,000 to 1 reduction. And it's really, it's a tip of the hat to the whole architecture team that we were able to laser focus on getting it that small to get this capability that was hard, right? People said, we think we want to do it, but nobody really knew how to do it until we came along and said, this is what we're going to do.
Gosh, that's amazing. As part of that process, though, it wasn't just a one and done. There was multiple milestones here during the entire project. What were some of the key ones you actually remember?
Early on, again, if you think about the period of time, it was about 2 years. I joined in the summer of 97. We released in fall of 99. Early on, within a couple of months, we had created what I called a one-sheet executive summary. Just this is the basics of what this is going to do, with about 8 features on it, and felt really good about the feasibility of that we were going to be able to do it. But at the same time, we were staffing a team. The team was very small when I started, and we probably had a couple of dozen people by the time the project was going full steam. And it was for me, anyway, it was a matter of going throughout the entire architecture front to back and saying, am I comfortable we can do this? We think we're going to do this. We're going to make a plan to do this, but we don't want to be wrong about it. So there's a fair amount of just ongoing feasibility studying in the early days. I'm giving you sort of my own personal involvement of how this was at that time. As teams came on and built up, there became much more dialogue among teams and me to them and them to each other and so on. And it became a collaborative development. It moved very fast. Of course, in those days, the teams were tiny compared to what they are now. But we got pretty clear about a direction, and then we just went and executed. And that's been the NVIDIA style from the beginning.
I was just going to point out to the viewers that there's actually still on the web the technical brief for transforming lighting of the chip of the GeForce 256, and it's a fun read. So it's out there. Anybody wants to get more into the weeds there.
I did happen to download it before starting this conversation, and there's a lot of gold in there, as well as with a number of the technical presentations that actually really apply to modern day game development to the same degree. I loved seeing, don't do this, it'll cause 100 millisecond stalls, and I'm like thinking, gosh, this sounds like just like modern day.
We didn't have many things on the website back then, so I remember when I was preparing for my interview at NVIDIA, I was actually able to read every single document that we had on the website in preparation, and that would be impossible these days because it's just so much documentation that's up there.
So we have a sense of what it does in hardware, and we already talked about kind of onboarding developers, evangelizing the features, but what did it actually mean for game experiences? And if you could recall, like, what were some of the most effective or memorable demos of the hardware back in the day?
Well, certainly, that was the era of Quake 3, Unreal Tournament, UT99. Quake 3 showed a tremendous benefit by, with the hardware TNL engine on the GPU. There was also some pretty effective demos at that time. There was this bubble demo, which was it was a NVIDIA tech demo that showed how to use cube maps for kind of like reflections on objects. There was also this grass demo, which could render, I think it was like 10,000 blades of grass, which at the time was really impressive. But that was kind of the advent of, or the introduction of, of the Quake 3 engine, which brought a lot of games, and the Unreal engine, which brought a lot of games on that engine as well. So that time was, you had Half-Life, which came out like a year prior to that. You had Quake 3, you had Unreal Tournament, you had Deus Ex, which came out shortly after that. Sims, I think, was somewhere around there as well. So a lot of the recognizable games or the beloved games came out around that era and ran great on GeForce 256.
Yeah, it was actually my job when I started there. I was the OpenGL guy. Everybody else was into DirectX. So they brought me on to sort of support the OpenGL, mostly Quake engine licensees. So this is like Raven Software. They did Soldier of Fortune, if you remember that. Elite Force 2. Then I was visiting BioWare. I had the good fortune of visiting them in February. It's in Edmonton. Not really the place you want to be in February, but for Neverwinter Nights. They were like also using OpenGL. And then, of course, obviously with id themselves. I mean, just sort of working with them and sort of optimizing the engine. I mean, there weren't a whole lot of levers back then, to be perfectly honest, because it was largely fixed function hardware. So you set up the pipeline and, as long as you didn't have something just like completely wrong, it was pretty much the performance was what it was going to be. So it wasn't until we started adding, buffers, we had various buffers where you could go and have the CPU and GPU writing the buffers and consuming buffers simultaneously with fences and so on. I mean, that's when it really started getting interesting. And then, of course, with per pixel lighting.
Actually, just from my standpoint, I actually remember one of the most impressive showcases of it was in the game Max Payne. It came out years later, actually, after the fact, but they had the ability to turn on and off software and hardware TNL. Like you could turn it on and off. And the CPU benefit was actually just kind of unbelievable. It was doubling your performance and actually freeing up the GPU to actually be limiting your performance now, unlike previously where I go back and play games from the 90s all the time on original hardware, and I tend to find that they're very, very CPU limited because the CPU had a lot more responsibilities during DirectX 6 era and earlier. And going back now, I kind of feel like we get into that more GPU limited era of gaming when GPU reviews now can actually start showing stuff, differences between performance that aren't CPU limited. And I think that was not always the case in the days beforehand, which brings me to the next question, actually, about kind of how it was received by the audience, press, tech press, and gamers alike. Do you have any recollection of what everyone thought about GeForce 256 post-release?
Well, as a press person, there was surely a lot of excitement. I'd like to back up a second, though. John Montrym mentioned the 40 or so graphics, GPU graphics board vendors. I thought there was like 60 or more, John. Back then, I mean, there were so many board vendors and a whole bunch of GPU vendors or GPU or chip vendors who also made boards. But, you know, there was fierce competition. And as the technology became more advanced, of course, things started to shake out, consolidate. I remember PC Mag, I was looking up some old issues on Google Books that January 2000, we said, you know, there was just a tremendous shakeup that occurred in the last 18 months. That was January 2000. So, and even after the shakeout, NVIDIA still had stiff competition, right, from ATI and 3DFX, which we soon became part of us, Matrox, S3, and a bunch of others. But yeah, there was a lot of excitement in the air, and we just couldn't wait to see what NVIDIA, you know, had up its sleeve after TNT2. I mean, you know, yeah, NV1, we know the story there. It was just too advanced for its time with all of its quadratic surface rendering and texture mapping. But Riva 128 and then TNT, then Riva TNT, then TNT2, you know, they were all great successes. So now we're like, oh my gosh, we're excited. What can NVIDIA be bringing, you know, to the table next? And then GeForce 256 hits with its advanced technology. So there was a lot of excitement, but it took a while, right, for the games to start utilizing the TNL functions, also environment, cube mapping, and other things too. But yeah, I would just say great excitement was in the air at the time.
Yeah, going back to something that Nick kind of touched on also, you know, at that time, you know, like you were saying, 40 or 60, however many GPU vendors. The other thing that was kind of interesting at that time is, you know, they all were very different from each other. You know, the image quality was very different across vendor to vendor. You know, like the filtering quality, anisotropic filtering quality was really different, you know, from Nvidia to 3DFX or to ATI at the time. And then, you know, after the GeForce 256, it kind of converged a little bit, but I kind of feel like it's almost getting back to, like, you know, where image quality is becoming really important. If you look at, like, you know, the upscaling or DLSS quality, and you look at things like ray reconstruction, things like that, where, you know, image quality is starting to really be important again and looked at. And, you know, guys like yourself, DF, do a great job of highlighting a lot of that. But yeah, certainly GeForce 256, when it was first introduced, you know, was very forward thinking. It was revolutionary. A lot of excitement around the future possibilities of the GPU and what it could bring to games. And, you know, like we talked about some of the games at that time, you know, after the GeForce 256, that's when you really start to see graphics accelerate at a rate that hadn't been seen before.
Yeah, I'll go back to per pixel shading. I mean, it was prior to that time, everything was Garo shaded. And, you know, then you had texture mapping, which added obviously another level of realism, but it was still not interactive with the lighting in the scene. And bump mapping was really a huge step towards what we see today. is that we're able to have a bump map. Now we're going to have displacement maps. We can have all sorts of maps. I mean, your average material might have, 11 different channels or more. And so back then it was 3, you had red, green, and blue, and that was it. And so we added normal to that, and that added so much immersion to the imagery, that it's almost like sort of at that point, it was this step function in terms of realism. And that was just the first step. But I mean, GeForce 256 brought that to the table. And, we were working on a few of those early titles like Evolva, I would say Giant Citizen Komodo, I guess. I think that was it. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. It's been a few years. Drones from Zeta Games. I mean, these were like the early adopters, and maybe they weren't the biggest games at the time, but I mean, that was sort of just the tip of the spear with regards to per pixel lighting and bump mapping and everything that would come later in Half-Life 2 and Far Cry and these games that really pushed the technology forward. And you brought up Remedy with, Remedy to this day is still pushing the limits of image quality in gaming. And, it's just, it's fascinating to see. We come up with the hardware and some of the techniques, but it's really the game developers that make the magic happen.
I think what Jacob, you said there was pretty interesting about how now image quality differences became like more at the forefront, as well as GPU specialization, kind of like different GPUs could do different things. And that is something that we see kind of in the road thereafter, as there was competing technologies trying to even achieve similar goals. And that's kind of what GeForce 256 brought on, as a new era of like competition where people were coming up with different solutions to the same problem. And I find that kind of amazing. So we just talked about it though, but I do actually want to hear a little bit more about the environment mapping because the demos were cool, but it took quite a while for games to actually start using things like cube maps, environment maps, or even bump mapping. Where do you think the hurdle was immediately after release? Was it in the amount of the things out there, or was it actually learning how to do it?
Yeah, I think it's some of both. I mean, there's always a chicken and the egg sort of dilemma there. There's developers typically want something that is going to run the same across the full swath of their install base. And that means every platform, today it could be mobile all the way up to the most performant 4090. And they want the same piece of code that looks the same everywhere, that can be QA'd the same. And it's just ubiquitous and dead simple, easy to debug. And we're asking developers the exact opposite of that. We want something that will only run on the latest generation. It will possibly only really be usable on the most capable within that architecture family. And, they're looking at it, they're going, well, the install base of that is 0. I mean, when we go and when we talk to a game developer about a new technology, the install base is 0. So they're like, why would I even bother with any of this? And the answer to that is, well, this is the future. And if you're not going to do it, somebody else is going to do it. And do you want to be state of the art? And that's how it was with ray tracing. And that's how it was back then with .3 bump mapping is sort of like low tech as it was at the time. I mean, sure, there were some techniques that needed to be developed. There was some geometry that needed to be solved. And, those weren't insurmountable. It's nothing compared to what we're talking about today with path tracing, right? Mm-hmm. So there was a bit of a learning curve. And, we would go and canvas game developers across the world and teach them how to adopt these techniques and put them into their game engines. But I think the main thing was the install base. And that continues to be sort of a back pressure on us taking new technology to the world. And that, like, I would say right now it's AI. I mean, it's like, how do you incorporate AI into a game, when you're limited with VRAM and you have the game engine is taking up 95% of the cycles in the GPU. How do you add an additional AI workload to that without completely cratering performance? And so obviously our future GPUs are bringing all of those things to bear, and we're coming up with new techniques to be able to go and run simultaneous workloads so that it doesn't introduce hitching. But, this is going to be another chicken and the egg problem. A lot of these developers are going to be waiting until there's a sizable enough install base before they jump. But then again, there are going to be those early adopters, and those are the guys that we're going to work with.
From our point of view, within architecture, we treated it as if you build it, they will come. You just don't know how long it will take them to come. Therefore, you had to be very cognizant of not overloading the chip with too much stuff. So we always walk that fine line of, we have a few percent to spend on something. What is the absolute best few things we can spend that on? And GeForce 256 exposed things like cube mapping. That's fantastic. But there was a whole lot that was configurable, but not yet really programmable. And that's okay. That was the right step at that time, because what followed very quickly was more and more programmability. And we spent many years climbing the programmability capability curve. You could talk about that having its next giant milestone, of course, where CUDA got introduced. And that was about 7 years later.
Yeah, it just really reflective on the modern times, like you just mentioned with AI, but also with any ray tracing, where it starts off as more or less like a DX7 kind of fixed function. You do this with it, and you only have a certain level of configurability, to kind of, now that the install base is there, you can increase programmability over time. And I kind of feel like that's what you get into in the GPU business quite often, actually. From Nick, I actually want to ask you, since you were in the press at this time, what was it like reviewing the product itself? And did it change, since it had so many more features and it was all this, different in comparison to just a graphics accelerator? Did it change the way you had to do GPU reviews for the future?
Always with new features added. We do this today to you guys. We're layering on new features every generation. We still want you to test all the old stuff too. But hey, make sure you can fit in this new feature set and do a good job at it. And that's what my team is here to help you guys with. It's really a challenge, right? Both performance and IQ benchmarking, and they're both critical, obviously, to the buying decisions that people make. And I will say that 3D graphics cards remain some of the hardest products to test effectively or thoroughly or whatever. I would also say that, looking back at the time when we were testing, we saw the new features come, but again, games weren't that day one using TNL much at all. Maybe Quake 3 very shortly thereafter. I don't remember the timing, actually, when Quake 3 implemented. Do you guys remember the actual timing on Quake 3?
I actually can't remember, but I do think there was at least an Nvidia demo level you can download that at least worked with it.
I think almost initially, I know Quake 3, there was like the beta Quake 3 test, I think at the time, maybe some of those versions had it incorporated shortly after or
but
right
we approach the testing, the same as even today. I mean, not much change in the basics of benchmarking. Make sure you have the proper test bed, make sure you have the good mix of games, make sure your settings are standardized as best as possible, while also still testing the unique features of the different vendor products. And there's just a lot more stuff to test nowadays, but IQ is super important. And it became more and more important, right, over time, not just FPS for the shoot 'em ups, and, and of course they go hand in hand. But yeah, so going way back, 3D Mark was around, 1998 or 99. Mad Onion was the original, remember?
99.
Mad Onion?
Yeah, Mad Onion was turned into Future Mark eventually, yeah.
And we had,
and then UL.
At Zip Davis PC Magazine, we had 3D WinMark. Some of your viewers might remember that way back. And then 3D WinBench. A lot of synthetic tests built into those benchmarks, but they were really important at the time. And, we had IQ targets that you'd run and say, okay, does the GPU match the target? Yes or no? So we'd rate things at a very granular level while testing, the handful of popular games too. But yeah, there's just so many factors, things to understand, analyze, and consider when you're buying graphics cards, for whatever use, be it the gaming or creator, or professional spaces. But anyway, yeah. So a lot of stuff to consider back then and today.
Yeah. Yeah, going back to the IQ at the time. Another thing is a lot of the cards actually didn't even support 32-bit color, which is hard to believe. But at that time, some cards only supported 16-bit color. But at that time, if you go back and you look at a lot of the reviews at that time of like systems or whatever, a lot of the focus was on the CPU. A lot of it was, GPU was almost like prior to the GeForce 256, GPU was kind of secondary. When it came to gaming performance, a lot of focus was put on the CPU, and I feel like after the GeForce 256, that's when it really started to change. And for gaming reviews, the GPU became more and more important. And today, it's clearly the most important aspect of in terms of performance for a gaming system. So yeah, it definitely GeForce 256 definitely brought about a change in the way that systems are reviewed and the emphasis of the GPU.
So the next question is kind of actually focused on the game development side of things, and or even just productivity, because now the GPU can be used for a variety of things. If you recall, maybe John Spitzer here, essentially, what did GeForce 256 mean beyond gaming for the rest of the PC industry?
Beyond gaming for the PC industry? Well, I mean, we had our Quadro line that we, I think, launched at or around that time frame. I mean, I can't remember the exact day, but that was bringing essentially the same capabilities to professional workstations, and that was my origins at IBM, and after that Silicon Graphics. So that was my wheelhouse. So I knew, I was on site at Dassault Systèmes working on CATIA. I was, working with Pro Engineer and SolidWorks and all of these different sort of CAD and DCC digital content creation tools. So I think the same capabilities that we're bringing to gamers, that is accelerated TNL and hardware, was actually arguably even more valuable to those guys because their workloads were already assuming that hardware existed. It was just at a much higher price point. And democratizing hardware accelerated TNL was a huge advantage to those people. But I mean, I think it was actually a much easier sell because the workloads that would take advantage of that hardware accelerated TNL already existed and had existed for many years prior to the release of our Quadro line.
Getting to some of the winding down questions here, what do you feel are the lasting legacies of GeForce 256 as a GPU, both in its effect on what it meant for gamers, what it meant for developers, and what it meant for hardware design of the future?
I mean, from a development standpoint, for game developers, obviously everybody assumes that you're going to be able to throw a huge number of triangles at the game and it's just going to be able to take it. I mean, you see modern, you would say, take Unreal Engine 5 with Nanite. I mean, if you show that thing in wireframe, many of these photogrammetry assets look like they're actually shaded because you really can't tell the interior of the triangle because the meshes are so dense. So, I mean, that was a huge sort of change, is that they could no longer, they no longer had to keep their triangle budgets in mind, because that was really a big point for them and was a thing that was keeping back their creative abilities, that they had to keep a triangle budget in mind at all times. And then again, it was the advent of per pixel lighting, which then brought, sort of like unprecedented realism to images. I think that's the legacy.
From the architecture point of view, I think of NV10 as a big bang from the standpoint of what did it do to the company Nvidia over time? If you looked at the company, let's say 10 years later, you would have had very large and capable organizations focused on so many different things. The image quality piece, 20 different aspects of that, of course, the developer enabling and so on. But if you wound all that back to NV10 days, each one of those teams was maybe one or two people. It was the beginning, but they all existed in our org chart at that time, just as a very, very small, basic beginning of what these things all became and what we're all enjoying now. in terms of what we deliver to the world and the marketplace in this technology.
I would add a personal note here that GeForce 256 really supercharged my interests. Again, I was at PC Mag at the time covering all kinds of products, but man, these GPUs are exciting, and I wanted to learn as much as I could about 3D graphics architectures, 3D pipeline, interviewing the vendors, trying to get under the covers of things, and then the enthusiast communities were absolutely nuts. They still are today. They're crazy. It's a lot of fun. They got me more excited. But, and I started reading the textbooks, the heavy duty stuff like Foley Van Dam, computer graphics principles. Of course, Extreme Tech had me deeply involved in reviewing and writing about the 3D pipeline. Dave Salvatore's infamous 3D pipeline story at Extreme Tech was long-lived and really gave people an insight into how things worked. Then I joined NVIDIA in 2005, and I have access to all the design documents, and oh my gosh, it was like, wow, there's hundreds. It's crazy. Hundreds of design documents, functional spec documents, internal architecture spec docs, all these things that talk about all the different units in detail. So I got to learn a lot more detail, but of course we can't present all that to the outside world for competitive reasons, right? But you really appreciate just how much technology are in is in GPUs. It is insane. So I'm that's my GeForce 256 really got me hyper jazzed on learning as much as I could about 3D.
Yeah, and from my side, I think I'm a little bit kind of with Nick here, that era, like 98, 99, with the advent of the GeForce 256 is really where I became really interested in graphics and gaming and PC gaming, and kind of sparked my career shortly after that. But yeah, if you look at the GeForce 256, it was a there was, like we talked about, there were so many manufacturers. GeForce 256 did something different. And I think there are a number of milestones that you could look over the entire GeForce history where a lot of the GPUs were doing something first, and that continues up to this day. You guys do a great job of covering all of the kind of recent innovations that we continue to bring to graphics technology. So the legacy continues to live on.
Well, I can definitely say from my perspective, the legacy is, to come back to what John said earlier, that bump mapping, that environmental mapping. I definitely remember loading up Halo on the original Xbox, and I actually spent a lot of time staring at textures for the first time in my life. And I really had no idea what was going on there. And it spurred my imagination and my desire to learn more about how exactly this was being rendered so that I could enjoy it. And ever since then, I've been into this, and I've gotten into my job. And that was an inspiration. And that wouldn't have happened with something out like GeForce 256. And definitely, I think this whole hardware specialization thing that it kind of represents, taking away a job that was done by a general processor, usually the CPU in games, for games that is obviously different in the professional space, and then putting that onto the GPU, accelerating it and getting it actually to be good at real time, I think is also another legacy that you see ever since then, in GPUs ever since then. But yeah, everyone, thank you so much for talking to me today about GeForce 256, an amazing GPU for the time and some amazing stories. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Anyway, if you did like this video, you know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, comment below, etc. Support us on Patreon to enable more work like this in the future. And as always, this is Alex saying Auf Wiedersehen und
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.